comes in, the changes come in waves, you know, like if you're the only person breaking the rules, the government's going to come down on you. But if there's millions of people who are all doing what you're doing, then you're much safer.
It goes the other way too, right? Like a lot of the time it's people break the rules and then they justify why it's okay. And I think with taxes, you already see that happening. Like, you know, even people who make like six figures, like they often list like, my wife is making half of it. Like people lie already about their income so they can declare, like, all the time. People lie on their taxes all the time. Everyone does it, even though the majority of people are still like, yes, we like democracy. Yes, we like the welfare state. Yes, we like government. But they're undermining it. They're undermining it at a very basic level all the time.
You are tuning in to the Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Welcome, students, to the next episode of the Multiversity Project. Today we'll be discussing post-anarchism through the lens of the book The Sovereign Individual, written in 1997. I read the book around 2016 and recommended it to my fellow hosts for this episode. The authors of the book view the history of humanity through the lens of what they call megapolitics and the economics of violence, an angle that seems to be missing from many political and historical reality tunnels. In this perspective, the world goes through megapolitical transitions, the fall of Rome, the transition from feudalism to industrialism, etc. This happens every 500 years or so, and that these transitions are precipitated by what they call megapolitical factors, such as topography, climate, microbes, and most importantly for us, technology, especially the technology surrounding the use of violent force. Using this historical lens, the authors explain how they see the current crisis of Western civilization, where we are and where we're heading. The book tells of a new era that is just beginning called the information age, where technology will drastically alter the political, social, and economic landscape, leading to the eventual collapse of many of the institutions we're familiar with, perhaps even the nation state itself. Personally, I discovered a lot of value in this book because, as we've noted in previous episodes, there's a meaning crisis going on in the West, because we seem to have lost the narrative of who we are and where we're going. I think the ideas in this book could be helpful in solving this crisis because it provides a relatively positive vision of the future, something that is hard to find these days. Ariel, do you want to introduce the first megapolitical transition, the fall of Rome?
Sure, Chris. The first megapolitical transition is one we've all heard of, the fall of Rome, which occurred in and around 500 CE. So this one is doesn't require much intro. Let's just dive into it. What parallels can we draw between our world today and the fall of Rome?
So I think the authors in the book make a good case that the fall of Rome, or I guess the Roman Empire, is analogous to kind of the nation state or the group of nation states that are kind of in charge of Western civilization right now. And I think you're seeing a lot of signs that those institutions are becoming kind of old and decrepit, and they're no longer able to keep up with reality, basically. And so they're kind of rotting. And this is what happened to the Roman Empire towards the end of its life. So I think there are plenty of parallels to be drawn.
Yeah, the United States certainly compares itself kind of self-consciously to Rome a lot of the time, like with its symbolism and stuff. And a lot of people make that comparison. Do you think, like, what specific parallels, do you think that's an apt comparison, Chris?
I do. For instance, well, all of the, like symbolism, I'm not sure if you said that, but yeah, there's like eagles and things that the Romans like to use. And there's all this pomp and circumstance surrounding government right now, very similar to how the emperors behaved. But yeah, it's almost sort of, and we'll talk about this later, but it's almost kind of like the church and religious institutions. It seems like every time we build institutions as a human race, we ascribe to it these kind of religious aspects, and they kind of come to permeate all aspects of our life. So the United States government is kind of like that now. You know, everywhere you look, people are arguing about politics and stuff. And
one basic parallel is that the Roman Empire was the most powerful in the world in history up to that point, and the U.S. is the same in the modern era. And it's also about the currency. So at the time, having control over the currency meant a lot, and it still means a lot. The U.S. dollar is probably the most used currency all over the world, and so that still gives the U.S. government a lot of power.
Yeah, another parallel that that they draw in the book between now and the fall of Rome is that people didn't really realize that the fall of Rome was happening because it was this long, drawn-out process. And they talk about how even centuries after Rome fell, people were still kind of make believing that it was there, and there were still kind of the trappings of having this empire, even though it was basically gone. And so, yeah, they use that to say, yeah, we're basically in that transition right now, and like Wolf Blitzer is going to come on CNN and be like, the American empire has fallen, and so they use that to talk about how it's this kind of gradual, slow process that people don't realize is happening even while it's happening.
I mean, I'm not really convinced that it's happening. Like we've talked about some similarities between Rome and the United States, but a lot of them seem kind of superficial, like that it's the biggest empire, or that it's people put a lot of religious or like adulation and religious significance onto it. But I don't know, it seems like there's a lot of differences too. Like Rome had kind of devolved into dictatorship or autocracy by the end of its reign. Rome had gone through quite a bit of economic decline. Rome was unable to collect taxes, and Rome was defeated in war very dramatically and cataclysmically, and by barbarians. So so it seems like, are there ways that you can see those elements paralleling the United States? Need some more specifics.
I think what the authors of the book would probably say is that those things are coming later. I think they would argue that we're past our prime, that the U.S. empire is past its prime, and that it's on the decline, but it's still very much, the 800-pound gorilla.
I mean, it's interesting too, because Rome was a republic, and then it became an empire, or like basically a dictatorship, a hereditary dictatorship. And it's interesting because the United States, at least in name, is still a republic, but it's I don't know. I mean, do you guys think like the United States is heading towards autocracy or dictatorship in some way?
It could be. It does seem that the things that make the U.S. government a republic, or the things that make the U.S. a republic, are kind of grinding to a halt. There's all this, especially Congress is the perfect example of this. It's just everybody's so divided and polarized that not much can actually get done. So basically the executive has been taking a lot more power for himself over the last few decades. Well, basically since, it's been a slow progression. I mean, Abraham Lincoln took a lot of power for the executive, and then TR took a lot of power, and then FDR. And then recent presidents have been just expanding it even more. Congress, I would say, compared to the president, has almost no power. And of course, that's where the Democratic part is. It's, everybody votes on who's going to be in Congress. And I mean, I guess the president is also elected, but I mean, you get at the end of the day, you get two choices, and the choices are chosen for you.
I mean, that's really interesting. Like, one argument I've heard is that like people say that like Obama put through a lot of what do they call them? Executive orders.
Yeah.
And now Trump is doing the same thing. But it's interesting because they say that with those executive orders, like, even though they're very unilateral, like they're less binding, like they can be undone by an executive order by the following president. Whereas with Congress, like if you have an act of Congress and you need an act of Congress to undo it. So it's only as easy to undo something as it is to put it into place. So it almost seems to be that like with this greater power towards the executive, it just means that like the country almost gets like locked down into like a frozen into like a standstill because each administration can just undo what the previous one did.
Well, what I wonder about more is the deep state. So, like for example, with Nixon, there's this quote. I think it was released in the Watergate transcriptions, where he said something like, "Well, we got to look out for Hoover because Hoover has something on all of us, even me." So, who was really running the show back then, and who really runs the show now? That's the question I think that's on a lot of people's minds. So it seems like in Rome, yeah, it's this autocracy or this dictatorship increasing, and now with Donald Trump, it kind of seems like this presidency becomes more and more of a joke, and maybe the presidents don't have as much power, and something else is going on that's a little shadier and difficult to determine.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I say the executive has a lot more power, what I really mean is the executive branch keeps getting more power. And of course, the CIA and the NSA and the FBI are all parts of the executive branch. And as you noted, they definitely have more power than the president in a lot of ways, since they're part of the deep state. They're part of the civil service. They're unelected bureaucrats, and they can spend their entire life in climbing the corporate ladder inside the U.S. government, basically. So those are the people that really have the power, and they're expanding their power, seemingly.
Okay. Well, one thing that's interesting in the fall of Rome is that you have this and one thing that's interesting in the fall of Rome is that for hundreds of years before the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire was basically, no one could stand up to it militarily. It was just this massive, incredible military force. And then you have very quickly these barbarians that just sort of overtake it. And there's a few reasons for that, but it makes me think that maybe there's some parallels to today when you have the U.S. military, which for a few decades was viewed as this really, formidable force. And the only thing that could possibly stand against it was an equally formidable force like the Soviet Union, or at the time, what may have seemed like an equally formidable force. And it was just the geopolitical struggle was between these massive empires with these multi-billion-dollar militaries. But in recent decades, you're seeing more that smaller forces can actually really put a dent in these giant militaries. Like you see like the Vietnam War, when you had like these small armies in the jungle using like guerrilla tactics, waging a war the United States could not win. You see in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Soviet Union went to war in Afghanistan, and the guerrilla fighters there so exhausted the Soviet Union that was a big factor in causing the fall of the Soviet Union. And more recently, in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq fought by the U.S., again, you see guerrilla tactics really putting these the massive U.S. military to the test. And that seems like a parallel to me. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, that definitely ties into the overarching theme of the book, that individuals will be able to stand up to empires using technology, using cryptocurrency and other things to hide their transactions and escape the arm of the empire.
Well, and I think there's a difference between the wars that you can win guerrilla style and the wars that you have to go all out to win. I think that once the U.S. won World War II, the U.S. and the Allies won World War II, they became kind of the world police, along with the Soviet Union, I guess, up until the Soviet Union fell. And yeah, after World War II, after the nuclear bomb was used, the scale of wars was drastically reduced because people in charge of governments all over the world never wanted to have to use nuclear weapons again. And so they tried to avoid that at all costs. And so So the conflicts were much smaller, and they involved kind of more sort of police actions. It was kind of like, the U.S. would send its military into Vietnam or something like that in order to prevent this much smaller country, Vietnam, from converting into a communist state. And it was a proxy war. I'm sure I guess the Soviet Union was helping the communists in Vietnam, and it was a different style of war where the U.S. wasn't fighting against a government. They were fighting against, like a band of rebels, basically, and they were fighting they were trying to totally control that territory. And, with Germany in World War II, all they had to do was basically, drive all the way to Berlin and then capture Berlin, and then the war was over. But that's not how these later style wars work, because there isn't like a place that you can go definitively destroy the enemy.
I guess if you take it all to its logical conclusion, you could even see something like a lone actor acting alone on the internet could maybe start to command leverage points of mega political violence that could threaten even large empires in the future.
Yeah, so people talk about anonymous, which is kind of a funny thing to talk about because of the way the media portrays it, as if it's a dark, shadowy organization, but really it's probably just a bunch of script kiddies. But then there's more serious offshoots of that, like LulzSec and other hacking organizations, which are more committed, and they do have power because they have intelligence and they have the access to the software and the right skills, so they can make a big difference.
Yeah, Anonymous mostly use like DDoS attacks, right?
I mean, they use all sorts of different hacking attacks. As Kurt said, it's probably mostly a bunch of script kiddies who are just, there's DDoS attacks are usually not script kiddies, actually. That's usually people controlling botnets. You need, in order to do a DDoS attack, you need to control a bunch of different computers. So you're probably pretty advanced if you're doing that. But there are lots of other ways that you can, if there's just one computer that you're trying to hack into, there's so many different vulnerabilities that you can potentially exploit. And you can use software that other people have written to do this. So that's what's meant by script kiddies. It's just like these teenagers who are downloading these pre-written scripts, hacking scripts from the internet and running them and getting into computers and causing mischief for the lulz. Hang on a second.
Yeah, but with the botnet thing, it was funny because up until a few years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, that was true. Like it was only large amounts of bots that were taking down sites and stuff like that, doing these distributed denial of service attacks. But at some point it kind of shifted, and people on 4chan would just download this, I don't know what the program was called. It was called like Skynet or something. And they would just run it, and it just sends a whole bunch of requests from their own computer. So it's like they don't even care that they're going to get discovered or something like that. And so they're doing it personally, and it doesn't take a lot of skill to do that. I guess the skill would really be in going on 4chan or something and convincing a whole bunch of people just to do this silly thing for a joke or for a protest or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. How do you see that kind of thing developing into the future?
I'm not really sure, but I think in a sense it shifts this power, because in some cases big organizations have to be wary that if they mess with the wrong people, then maybe somebody's going to come in and just take down their website or try to even take down their server in more extreme cases, or hack into them and steal their information and things like that. At the very least, big organizations have to be more aware of that. And in extreme situations, I'd say, I guess national secrets could be exposed to the world.
Yeah, so we're going to move on to our next transition, which is between the Dark Ages and the Feudal Ages. Now, the Dark Ages were interesting because they were, in many ways, they were anarchic. Like at that time, Europe was being farmed mostly by small, independent yeoman farmers, like family-held kind of farms. And this was kind of a rare situation in the history of agriculture in many ways, but it was possible because the farmers were dispersed very, very widely over the territory of Europe. And they had just developed these new technologies that allowed them to farm further north than had previously been possible. So farms were highly dispersed, centralized power was weak, and the returns on violence were very low. So it made this possible. But all this changed when the technology of armed cavalry improved, and you get knights on horseback. So knights were a kind of super weapon. They would travel across Europe, and they could basically rob and pillage farms with impunity. And for a while, like around leading up to the year 1000, they were kind of carrying out this reign of terror over these small farmers we were talking about. So what happened is you get a situation where some knights were kind of consolidating their holdings, kind of taking over large amounts of territory, and other groups were more defensively kind of consolidating in order to defend against the knights. Like some independent farmers sold themselves into serfdom just to have protection against knights. And the armor was very expensive. It was beyond what most farmers could afford to buy. So what happened was the church ended up restoring order. They did this in part by sanctifying the knight's position. Like they made the knights nobility and gave them like sort of a blessing of God, so to speak. And through that, the church and the knights ended up being very powerful. The knights led to the system of feudal lordship, and the church became the predominant power during the feudal period. And for a while, this was led to massive increases in wealth and efficiency because the church imposed order and they built a lot of infrastructure and stuff like that. And so this led into the feudal age. So this is a really interesting time. One question we could ask is like, do we really view the Dark Ages as anarchic? Like, do we agree with that interpretation of them?
I mean, so in the sense that there wasn't a central empire controlling everything, at least where the Roman Empire used to be, and there were sort of these roving barbarian gangs, or I guess some of them were agricultural civilizations. I guess maybe all of them were. But the point is they were much smaller jurisdictions. So the Roman Empire just broke up into a bunch of different little regions that became autonomous. And so in that sense, yeah, I would say it was anarchic, where political power was very decentralized and there was lots and lots of violent conflict. So I would say that also made it quite anarchic.
Yeah, like there was still kings and stuff like that. Like there was still kings in a court, but they had very little power and very little power to tax, and they kind of just resolved local disputes and took what they could get, I guess. Another thing that was interesting about the Dark Ages is it led to almost the disappearance of literacy from Europe. Like the church kind of kept literacy going, but by and large, very few people were literate, like massively less than during the Roman times. Like one thing that's interesting is like during the Dark Ages, they say if you were literate, you were basically immune from all criminal persecutions. Like you could commit murder and get away with it if you were literate, just because it was such a powerful skill back then.
Yeah, so I guess anarchy in one sense is decentralized political power, but in another sense, it's lack of rule of law. And I think that's what you're getting at, where, some people were basically outside the law, or even lots and lots of people were outside the law.
Yeah, and like it makes you wonder, like one thing they talk about in the book is like the Seychelles introduced this system where they have like an extradition free. Their government has committed to not practicing extradition, and if someone pays $10 million, they can basically, I'm not sure if it's PR or citizenship, but they can go be there. And so it's almost like in this day and age, if you have enough wealth, there's ways to get out of any kind of criminal prosecution as well. So it's almost, you can see a parallel there a little bit, or at least moving towards a parallel in a way that maybe didn't exist 100 years ago.
Yeah, I don't know if this is something I should bring up, but have you guys heard about all the stuff happening with Jeffrey Epstein?
No, tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's this sex offender, very, very rich sex offender who owns at least one private island and apparently is very good friends with a lot of politically powerful figures such as Bill Clinton and Donald Trump and maybe some other people. And this guy apparently was charged as being a sex offender and didn't have to register on any lists for like 8 years or something like that. And it was discovered that all of these police chiefs and judges were basically protecting him. And so, yeah, it's a pretty horrible, disgusting state of affairs. But I think it demonstrates that what you said is true, that there are ways of just being so rich that the laws don't apply to you in our day and age.
Yeah, I mean, is there something like a triumph of justice in that he's being like charged now?
Probably, but I guess a lot of the people who are associated with him will still manage to avoid the long arm of justice.
Yeah, I don't actually know if he's being charged now. Do you have more information on that? Sorry, I guess I should have studied this more before bringing it up.
Sure. Well, I remember the first time he was charged, I think he was given some titular charge, or like something which was very easy for him to kind of ignore. I don't think he actually went to jail, but maybe had like a 12 months suspended sentence or something like that. So basically it was like a slap on the wrist. He didn't actually have to do anything. And it's supposedly a lot of pressure on the courts and on the prosecutors to just let it go.
He was charged. He was charged on July 6, 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking. He was arrested. Sorry, not charged. He was arrested for sex trafficking of minors just recently.
Okay, yeah. And I've heard stories about this guy for a long time, and how people were just like, yeah, he apparently seems to be this like pedophile sex trafficker, and he's still at large and doesn't seem to be getting in trouble at all. So I guess that is sort of a triumph of justice that he was arrested. So hopefully something happens with that.
Yeah, there seems to be almost this like battle going on right now in the culture of like the sort of people who have a lot of money being able to be above the law, or like corporations being able to be above the law, and like this sort of reassertion of like the rule of law.
So with the Epstein case, I think it's really important to note, I believe this is actually without precedent. This is the non-prosecution agreement from 2007, 2008. This 53-page federal indictment. He agreed to a plea deal to grant immunity from all federal criminal charges to Epstein, as well as 4 co-conspirators and any potential unnamed co-conspirators. So anybody who might be involved has freedom from prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the pure impunity. And I think you always see this effect where richer, more connected people tend to have an easier time at life when stuff goes bad. Then they have resources so that stuff doesn't go as bad, compared to the vast majority of the population who don't have those resources. And when stuff goes bad, life falls apart. I think in any society, you're going to see some degree of that. But I think the important thing in more sort of these more anarchic societies that we're talking about is that people are breaking the law with impunity, and it's widespread. And after a long time of this, the general public, gets wind of it, and they realize that, well, none of the people running things are actually following the law, And so that makes the general public lose respect for the law too. And then you see this kind of general breakdown in law and order, which I don't think you've seen that yet, but I think if you look at places like Portland, where there's just like rival like mobs in the streets, like left and right, basically just like fighting each other in the streets. And the police are like not doing anything about it, from what I understand. So
I think one of the distinctions that's really important is between corruption during a period of like consolidated political power where there's like a large central authority, and like just the lack of rule of law during an anarchic period. And it's not really clear what's going on now. Because in the book, they distinguish between like the Dark Ages, where if you were literate, you were above the law because the law was just really weak and there wasn't a lot of literate people, versus they talk about like the feudal period where the church became extremely, like shockingly corrupt. And like church members were just able to like just be above the rule of their own institution, basically. And it seems like those are pretty different phenomenon, and it's not really clear which one's happening now.
yeah, it does seem to me that the current transition has a lot of parallels with a lot of these previous transitions. So it's not like we're just having one of them again, as it were. So,
I mean, it seems like there's a difference between like something like a politician or a very powerful figure who's able to like basically buy indulgences, so to speak, which suggests that we're in like a little more consolidated period, versus like the idea that people who are just more mobile or have a certain kind of know-how are able to game the system, which kind of speaks to, I guess in a way it's similar. In one case, the system is becoming corrupt, and in the other case, the system is becoming unenforceable. It's a subtle but important distinction, I think.
right, and I think we're, as I mentioned in our Fall of Rome discussion, I think we're kind of on the decline where you're seeing more and more political corruption, but you're not seeing the sort of general corruption of the rule of law yet. And hopefully we don't get to that point, but we might, especially given what Kurt was talking about with you know, the rise of the cyberspace and the digital realm, and you know, people who can basically people who can stand up to nation states as individuals, at least in cyberspace. And so, you know, the internet is kind of like the Wild West. You know, it's like this new frontier and nobody really controls it yet. And the book argues that nobody will ever control it. I'm not so sure about that, but I guess we can talk about that in a bit.
So during my lifetime, I have noticed that in Australia, it seems like people are much more willing to flaunt the law than previously. So when the taxes start increasing a lot, people start eventually saying, hang on, what's going on here? And it becomes accepted knowledge. Everybody knows that you can go to certain markets and find illegal tobacco, or that is untaxed tobacco. And now you can even, in certain places, you can go to a corner store and find untaxed tobacco. And so it seems like people in general in Australia, they now acknowledge that one thing is you can avoid the law, and they also seem to acknowledge that politicians are corrupt. So once upon a time, it seemed they had this naive notion that politicians were just incompetent, and when money went missing, it was just mismanagement. And now they seem to understand a little better, when money goes missing, it's theft.
Right. And I think that we can draw a lot of parallels between that situation and what was happening with the church towards the end of the feudal age. Yep, where, you know, the you know, I guess the general public probably didn't hear the story of the Borgia Pope, but you know, how he just had these like sex parties in the papal palace and was like, had scribes that were recording how many times the man orgasmed, and was basically like keeping score, you know, who could finish the most times. And then he would hand out prizes and stuff to the winners. And
these are the priests and the popes that were doing this.
Literally the Pope and like the cardinals and like the special bishops.
Yeah, the Pope had like eight acknowledged bastards.
Yeah, he actually had, what was it? He had a daughter out of wedlock, obviously, because he was the Pope. And then he fathered a child with her. And it's just like this crazy incest fest.
Yeah, he might not actually have fathered a child. He probably actually didn't father a child with her, but it was just, there were rumors and stuff. Anyway, it was really bad. And if you look at what happened in the centuries after, the church continued to exist and Christianity continued to exist, but it underwent a reformation. So do you guys think, how might that parallel what's going to happen with politicians and nation states?
Well, I think that I've talked about this a lot before on our show, how and the sovereign individual talks about this a lot too, where basically as the problems with the institutions bubble to the surface and people realize that they're getting screwed, what should happen is you should see sort of more like freer alternatives. I like to draw the parallel between the government industry and what happened with the media industry and BitTorrent and Napster. And like, I think what you need to have first is you need to have, like a realization that, you know, the product being provided is not that good and the cost that it's being provided for is very, very unfair. And so once you have that, then you have kind of upstart competitors. In the case of music and media, it was, you know, Napster, and the government quickly shut it down because it could, but then you had this decentralized alternative that couldn't be shut down. That was BitTorrent. And then a few years after, you know, basically people were just sharing copyrighted material with impunity and nobody was really getting caught. The government fined people, you know, exorbitant amounts of money a few times, but basically it continued. And so what this forced the media industry to do was it forced them to adapt and to start providing a better service at a lower cost. And so what I would argue and what the book argues is that the same thing is going to happen to governments and basically all of our institutions. And so first you're going to see small centralized alternatives to government, things like seasteads and micronations. And then you're going to see completely decentralized forms of government. And these will be mostly on the internet, at least at first. But you'll start to see competition basically against the old dinosaur forms of doing things. And then what this will do is it will force governments to adapt, and it will force them to provide a better service at a lower cost.
Yes. So we're already starting to see this. So just in recent months, there was a case where an American and his Thai partner, set up a seastead, this little tiny, about 20 square meters, I think, artificial island, about 26 kilometers off the coast of Thailand, technically in international waters. The Thai Navy didn't really like it. They said, well, it might be international waters, but we still control this area, so we're going to threaten you. And they threatened them with the death penalty. Those two individuals are now on an unknown location. But a couple of months after that, 9 more individuals were threatened by the Thai government for trying to do a similar thing. So it's like with Napster or similar technologies, if there's only a couple of people doing this, then it's quite easy to pin them down, and the threat seems very real. But once you have 9,000 people, over 9,000 people trying to set up their own islands there, then it becomes very difficult to stop.
Right, exactly. I mean, what are they going to do? Whack-a-mole with, you know, millions of little seasteads everywhere? So yeah. I mean, I think that you could see on international waters a resurgence of piracy. You know, like kind of what we had on the waters in like the 1600s and the 1700s.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the book they talk about the distinction between employee-controlled government versus customer-controlled government. And so employee-controlled government is kind of government controlled by politicians and people who are primarily welfare recipients, and which they define as employees in the book, because the idea is that they're providing a service to government, which is supporting the government in exchange for getting these benefits. And so they talk about the characteristics of government that function like that, and they talk about the characteristics of government that would be more customer-driven, so driven by taxpayers, people who are paying like the balance of like basically where influencing government is proportional to how much tax you pay for it. They're basically suggesting that first, that transition is inevitable because as people become more mobile and as commerce becomes more located digitally, where it's harder to control, people are going to be able to pick between governments and it will become like a buyer's market, so to speak. And they also talk about how that's going to basically result in the erosion of or destruction of the welfare state because taxpayers aren't going to be willing to subsidize all those people in the same way anymore. It's going to be massive changes. Like, what do you guys think about all that?
Yeah. So I think that you're seeing that already. You're seeing the nation state is basically the commercial industries. People who are providing goods and services are earning increasingly large amounts of money, and the government is decreasing in its ability to capture that and redistribute it. And so you're seeing, I think that the election of Trump is a sign that is kind of like a marker of people are not feeling as supported as they used to be by the state because they're still getting the entrepreneurs are growing in their wealth, but their wages are staying the same, and so they're demanding they're demanding of the government. They're saying, hey, where's our largesse? Where's our free money?
So how do you view Trump as connected to that?
Well, so Trump ran on a platform of the little guy in the manufacturing industry is getting screwed. And this was a very, very large voter bloc. And so it was a very successful strategy. I think he read the market correctly, which is that, people are not happy with their wages stagnating, while entrepreneurs who are taking all the risks and creating most of the value in the economy are earning a larger slice of the pie. And so, as they talk about a little bit later in the book, unions and things are a representation of the violence that workers can inflict on enterprises. And so I think the catering to the labor sector is important for maintaining law and order, because if you don't keep those people happy, those people are a large percentage of the population, and they can do a lot of damage if they're not happy. So I think Trump catered to those people's wishes, and then he got elected because they were a large and vocal subset of the population.
But I have heard the argument that the market is already corrupted by these non-free market forces that are specifically disadvantaging American workers and small businesses, and that Trump is counteracting that with his own non-free market policies.
That's a really interesting argument. What have you heard what these anti-free market forces are?
One example is like there's these free trade deals, right? Like these free trade deals that the United States has with all these countries around the world, which make it very easy for large multinationals to move to a different country and to set up operation there. So large multinationals are very mobile, but at the same time, the U.S. has all these you could call it like, not that these things are necessarily bad or anything, but stuff like labor laws and like safety laws and welfare. They still have a welfare state going on, and they still have a very highly regulated labor system within the United States. So you end up with a situation where, let's say there's a manufacturing plant. If they operate in the United States, it's extremely expensive because the government is pushing all these regulations on them. They make it very expensive for them to operate. But if they go to like China or Malaysia or something, they can set up they can escape that system and set up a plant for very cheap. So it's this idea that they're trying to have like a highly regulated system that supposedly benefits workers, but that doesn't work because companies are highly mobile. So the idea is that what Trump is doing, and what Bernie Sanders was also basically promising to do, is to set up stronger trade barriers, so that basically the idea is that we're still going to have these laws here, but they're going to apply to everybody, because right now they're not applying to multinationals. So multinationals are basically in a bargaining position where they can have everything and the worker has nothing.
So I would just push back on that. Those are anti-free market forces. To me, free trade seems like a free market thing, and barriers to trade strikes me as anti-free market. And so those people who are making that argument, I feel like are on pretty weak philosophical ground.
Well, they're not making the argument that Trump is free trade. They're making the argument that things were already anti-free trade, as I just described. That situation I just described was the situation kind of in the neoliberal era, like before Trump. And the idea is that Trump is counteracting that with his own. So they're not really saying Trump is free trade, but they're saying that Trump is restoring at least a balance that didn't exist before.
Yeah, so because there were disadvantages on one side, now he's introducing disadvantages on the other side. And that sounds pretty accurate to me. I don't necessarily like it, but yeah, I guess if fairness is valuable, prioritized over other things like freedom.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I guess I can see the point where basically labor laws are anti-free market. And so that if that's what's causing the multinationals to seek labor in countries that have cheaper labor, then it makes sense to me that, yeah, I mean, it's taking these anti-free market things and it's adding more anti-free market things in order to balance out the discrepancies that the original anti-free market things caused. As a free market guy myself, I would take away the original free market things, and that would be a free market position. But I guess you're right that Trump and Sanders were basically both promising to counteract the anti-free market things that were happening with other more anti-free market things, such as trade barriers and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, to have like a completely free market solution or to have a completely free market balancing to the situation that existed before Trump, like the neoliberal consensus, you would need to get rid of all borders. Because that way, as it is, like borders don't exist for the multinationals to a very large degree, so they can kind of move around however they want to. And so you need to allow the same situation for the workers, so the workers can move around however they want to, which would be a pretty like traumatic change for the world. Maybe one that's needed. I don't know.
Right, or the other thing they could do is get rid of all the labor laws and the welfare. And if they did that, then basically workers in America would have to compete with workers in every other jurisdiction. And so that would definitely drive down the cost of labor in America, which would drive down the cost of living for most of America, which would cause probably a lot of violence.
What do you think, Kurt?
Well, getting back to your question before about employee-controlled governments versus customer-controlled governments, which is raised in the book, I think it sounds reasonable to me to go to a government and expect them to provide services for what I pay them for. But a lot of people are going to find that idea offensive because we've all been brought up with the idea of democracy and everybody has their say and everybody is equal. Everybody can have a vote. And the idea, like I know at one time in the United States, there was a voter tax. So you had to pay a dollar before you could vote. Or before that, I believe it was just the landowners. They were the people who paid taxes, so they were the people who had the say in what the government did. Now today, those ideas will receive a lot of backlash. A lot of people are just going to say, no, that's, I don't want just some rich guy deciding what the government does. But they might change their minds when they start to see that actually there's a lot of choice in government. But it's hard to reach that point.
I mean, one thing I really liked about this book is it wasn't really making it like a moral issue, like the way that I see a lot of voluntarists and ANCAPs do. Like, government it's so unfair that they're taking my money and people are going to realize it's not fair and then there's going to be a shift. And like that never really never really seemed very convincing to me because it always seemed like there was other moral considerations that could come into play. But in this book, it was really interesting because they're talking about not making a moral issue. They're just talking about what's happened and what's going to happen and just what the incentives are to violence and how that could shift the world. And it's all just very analytical. It's kind of like, well, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's fair or not, this is what's going to happen. And I found that a lot more compelling and interesting
Well, yeah, and they specifically say that moral norms shift around the same time that these mega political transitions are happening, and of course, you can see this in the feudal age, as we're discussing. I guess we should transition soon, but yeah, basically, at the beginning of the feudal age, the church was this moral standard bearer, and they said, here's these knights are noble and they're supposed to follow this chivalry thing. And for a while, everybody kind of believed it. And then towards the end of the feudal age, it started falling apart because people were realizing, man, all these people are just buying indulgences, right? Like literally, it's more economically beneficial to basically pretend to follow the rules and then break them with impunity than to actually follow them. And so, you can only take your morality so far. Like eventually you have to look around you and realize, well, everybody's breaking the rules. And so like I'm hurting myself by trying to follow the rules. And so I think this is what a lot of ANCAPs and voluntarists are doing, is they're basically saying, hey, this government thing that everybody thought was moral is actually immoral. And so I think a lot of times they take an extreme moral case, an extreme moral stance in order to highlight, basically that government isn't as, isn't this, they don't have the high moral ground. Maybe they did at some point, but they don't anymore.
Yeah, like the book talks about how like during the industrial age, like big governments that were taxing heavily were actually quite necessary. It's like if you have an industrial project, it's very susceptible to sabotage and to violence and to theft, and it can't move around easily, and it's got a lot of expensive equipment and all this stuff. And so you basically either need your own militia to protect it, or you need a government to provide a militia. And in that situation, having a big government and having kind of almost an extravagant government, it made sense. Like it was incentivized by the conditions of the time. And now the book is arguing that like with the shift towards more a digital economy where companies are going to be a lot smaller, a lot more mobile, sometimes just one person, they're going to be able to move around the world. It's going to be very hard to tax them, and they're going to be less incentivized to be taxed because their assets are going to be much more easily protected, often like cryptographically, than by anything the government can provide. And so it's not like the government has always been evil, or like the government is this good thing that's going to be destroyed. Like they're not making a moral judgment about it, even though maybe there are moral considerations that will come into play. They're just saying like the conditions have changed, and so the incentives around government are changed, and which is really scary because, the idea that the welfare state's going to collapse, it's a very scary idea, but it is a compelling argument they make.
Yeah, and as you noted, more and more people are so technological circumstances are evolving such that people are going to become harder and harder to tax. And so what this is doing is it's creating this kind of moral shift where it used to be that people would feel guilty about not paying their taxes. And now, now that many people are operating outside, they're traveling around all the time, it really doesn't make sense for them to hand a third of their earnings to some government, that they don't interact with much. And so, from both a practical and a moral standpoint, it's making less and less sense for people to pay taxes. And so, there's basically two transitions that happen. There's at first you have to feel okay about not paying certain taxes. And then you have to feel okay about actually not paying those taxes. Like there's believing that it's okay, and then there's actually doing it. And I think it comes in, the changes come in waves. Like if you're the only person breaking the rules, the government's going to come down on you. But if there's millions of people who are all doing what you're doing, then you're much safer.
It goes the other way too, right? Like a lot of the time, it's people break the rules and then they justify why it's okay. And I think with taxes, you already see that happening. Like, even people who make like six figures, like they often list like, my wife is making half of it. Like people lie already about their income so they can declare, like, all the time. People lie on their taxes all the time. Everyone does it, even though the majority of people are still like, yes, we like democracy. Yes, we like the welfare state. Yes, we like government. But they're undermining it. They're undermining it at a very basic level all the time.
Exactly. And I just want to note that all of us are very good taxpayers, and we all pay all of the taxes that we're supposed to pay. I think this is a good time for us to transition to the gunpowder revolution, where the feudal age transitioned into the industrial age. Kurt, will you lead us through that transition?
So, well, a lot of it is a lot of the transition from the feudal era to the industrial era is about technology. Before the industrial age, without any form of locomotion, most people would stay where they were born. Only rich people could really import goods. So, for example, today we might take a fabric like cotton for granted. We say, well, it's a natural fiber. I guess it always existed for a long time. But it really, say, if you lived in Britain in 1500, it would be very difficult to get it, something like that, like a cotton shirt. So most people lived in villages working in agriculture. Agricultural work is seasonal, so sometimes it was hard to get work, and that meant there's a lot of poverty. You couldn't really depend on regular work. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, so around 1707, very interesting thing happened. A fellow named Abraham Darby found a way to smelt iron using coke, which is like a refined form of coal. And that led to a whole bunch of technological changes, and people could make standardized iron forms. People could find more consistent working factories. They still had to deal with terrible conditions in the factories with the trains and the steamboats. Imports and exports opened up due to increased productivity. For the first time in history, there was a middle class. And that also meant that it was easier for governments to tax. And as Ariel mentioned before, it meant there was a big benefit in having a government protect people or factories. So that led to the rise of this new mega political structure, the advent of the nation state. In the Industrial Revolution, of course, there were a lot of people like loom weavers and this sort of thing who were very angry about the changes, or they didn't know how to adapt. And some of those people were the Luddites, who would go around and maybe they'd burn the new factories or destroy the mechanical looms. So what kind of Luddites do we expect in the present day? Well, how will people react to these changes if they can't keep up?
I mean, one parallel I can see right off the bat is you talk about loom weavers. Like, it's interesting, like when they made the transition between the 3-person loom to the 2-person loom, there was like violent resistance protests against that for hundreds of years, because it was like they're putting the 3rd loom man out of business and it's so terrible for him. And it reminds me a lot of this, and that debate's happened over and over and over again throughout the whole industrial age, because that's what industrialism is, right? Industrialism is like, you have grandma sewing needle by thread, sewing a sweater for you, and now you have this machine that like just does the whole thing in like a small fraction of the time that it would have taken grandma, and now you have way more sweaters, and poor grandma doesn't have any work. So you're seeing that like it's been happening for hundreds of years, and now you see that happening in a way that is both kind of new but also kind of old. Like with the AI revolution, you see like more and more now knowledge work, which before was untouched by machines. Like industrialism was kind of body work being taken over by machines, and now you see mental work more and more is being taken over by machines, and a lot of people are saying that that's going to be this terrible thing. And so that's one parallel I see. I'm really curious what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like every presidential election, we have candidates catering to these people who are not that kind of unskilled, I guess, workers, people who are easily replaceable by other people doing the same work. And so you see Andrew Yang right now campaigning on a platform of universal basic income. And what he talks about is, well, all of these truck drivers and all these retail workers are about to be put out of business, put out of work by artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, computers that can sell stuff to you, Amazon. You don't need to go to a store to shop on Amazon. You just go to the website and it's you and the computer. So yeah, I think basically every presidential election, you see candidates catering to those voters, because those are, I mean, if you want to win an election, the thing that you want to do is you want to identify the issue that most people are angry about and just campaign really hard on that. So Trump was really good at this. That's why he got elected. And now I think Andrew Yang has a good chance of getting elected in 2020, if people hear about him.
Yeah, I guess the sovereign individual argument kind of destroys the idea of UBI, unless there's like a global world government.
Can you remind me what their argument was? I don't remember that part.
Well, their argument is basically that states are going to lose the ability to extract high levels of taxes from productive citizens, because people are going to be mobile and have less assets to protect, so they'll be in a better bargaining position relative to governments. And without government's ability to extract high levels of taxes and redistribute it, it does seem like it dooms the UBI project, unless all the governments collude basically over all the territory of the earth and manage to extract some kind of universal tax as part of a global political order.
Right. So I agree with you that universal basic income would be unsustainable in the long run. But I do think that especially the United States government is going to have power to tax and extract wealth from its economy for at least the next generation or two. And I think that universal basic income could be sustainable for a generation or two. I think you're probably right that eventually it's going to have to expand worldwide. But yeah, I agree that it's unsustainable.
I wasn't necessarily making that argument. I was just kind of presenting a line of thought. But one thing, what you're saying makes me think of is like, I don't know, like one thing I was thinking while I was reading the book is like I was feeling really sad, because I was sort of feeling like this idea that the welfare state's going to be destroyed and stuff like that, or that it was only sort of like this blossom of the moment that's going to wilt much sooner than anyone hoped. And this idea of equality was just sort of this local historical miracle that took place, and that is not going to happen again. Like, it seems very sad to me, and it just sort of makes me think like, it almost makes me feel like I want to like appreciate this time that we're in more than maybe I have before, because maybe like this period of like the welfare state and redistribution and this drive towards equality that we have right now as a civilization, maybe this might be the only chance, right? Like we have this idea that we're just going to keep moving toward more and more and more towards equality, and then eventually everything's going to be equal, and we're going to sort of be like Star Trek socialism of some kind. But maybe we're not. Maybe we're like moving towards a much more individualistic world where it is going to be more like the Dark Ages again. Like maybe it will be more like every man for himself. And maybe like if you're someone who's not productive right now, or if you're someone who's not who is underprivileged, like this could be your only chance. Like this could be the only chance for the underprivileged people to find their footing. Like this chance might not happen again. And that's, in a way, I feel like it's both a motivating idea and a really scary idea.
Yeah, I think you've hit upon one of the central themes of the book, which is that the changes ahead are scary and drastic, but if you're reasonably competent and you take responsibility for yourself, then you can thrive in the coming age. I do think that the welfare state going away is not necessarily going to be as bad as you make it out to be. I think that capitalism in general has been increasing the amount of wealth in general in society, even for the poorest people. And so I think there's no reason to expect that it will not continue to do that. So I think that, maybe upward mobility might be affected, but I think in general, the standard of living should continue going up for everyone.
I don't know about that. Like, it seems to me that a big part of why the standard of living has risen for the poorest is because there has been, well, A, because there has been redistribution, and B, because unskilled labor has been valuable. And the book argues that those two things are intricately linked. And as the value of unskilled labor plummets with the rise of automation, and as the ability of governments to redistribute erodes, I don't know, it's hard for me to see a way forward for the lower classes of the world that's not, quite grim.
Well, so the way that I see it, the sort of lower classes in every jurisdiction are, of course, the least privileged, but they still have the tool of violence, and they'll always have that tool. And so, if the rulers or the governmental company or whatever you want to call it, the security organization that's taking care of that jurisdiction or has a monopoly on that jurisdiction, if that organization is somehow making the laborers unhappy, then the laborers will get restless and violent. And so it at least has to provide a good enough standard of living so that to keep itself in power, basically. And so basically it has to keep the laborers somewhat happy.
I don't know. I feel like you're still calling them laborers, but maybe there'll be no labor for them to do. It may be the people who are the proletariat of the 19th and 20th century, like the unskilled worker. Because that's the thing, like they talk about like the rise of industrialism. One thing it did is it made it so that unskilled labor was extremely valuable, like in the assembly line. Like in the feudal age, you had basically, if you wanted to be a shoemaker, you had to have a very high level of skill. You had to rise above the other peasants and figure out the skill that was very complicated, unusual. Whereas in the industrial age, if you wanted to work at a shoe factory, you need zero skill. Like you can be trained in a single day and you're basically just doing the same repetitive motion over and over again. And that was very valuable in the industrial age because it was these factories were run by armies of unskilled laborers producing these assembly line products very quickly. And as that structure is very, like, the authors are kind of right, like that structure is dying, or at least it seems to be. And as it does, like there might not be a lot of place for unskilled workers. Like it might be machines producing those shoes, or they might be 3D printed in the future, and you don't need any unskilled labor. You need like a skilled technician, one skilled technician, and that's it.
Okay. So my case is that people have more access to information, to educational material, to YouTube videos, Coursera, Khan Academy, all of these resources, and they can take advantage, improve their skills, and improve their life.
Yes, I agree. And another point that I wanted to bring up is that while the value of labor is falling, the value of the basic necessities of life is also falling. And so things like food and shelter and smartphones, access to information, all of this stuff is going down in value over time. And so while the jobs that that unskilled laborers are doing now are going away, I don't see a reason why they won't be able to find jobs at lower pay levels that nevertheless provide them the ability to survive. So definitely the transition should be rough. A lot of people will be angry, maybe even violent. But this is the same argument that people have been repeating throughout the ages. With the looms and things. Oh no, these people are losing these jobs. We need the government to force the companies to put those jobs back. And it's like, because those jobs are permanently gone. And then what happens a generation or two later? There's all these new jobs. I think there will always be something productive for people to do. And if there isn't, again, their cost of living will be extremely low. So they should be able to find, somebody, maybe a family member or a charitable organization or something like that they can depend on.
Yeah. Well, there might be a generation or two that really suffers in the middle.
Yeah. So I want to bring the conversation around a little bit to the book's argument about why the nation state was dominant in the industrial age and why specifically democratic liberal democracies were dominant in the industrial age. Okay, so basically this story, this narrative that the book tells about how history unfolds in relation to the economics of violence. It has these phases where basically the most important aspect of basically the most important mega political factor that determines these most recent transitions has been the relative economic benefit of attack versus defense. And so when attack is cheaper than defense, what you see is the predominance of large military organizations. And when you see defense being cheaper than attack, what you see is what you saw in the feudal age, which is castles, places that were easily defended, and political power is very decentralized. And so in an era of defense, political power becomes decentralized. In an era of offense, political power becomes centralized, and you get these large nation states. And so their argument is that somewhere around 1500, gunpowder weapons were invented, and from that point on, offense was much cheaper than defense. And so instead of, feudal ties where, you had lords, pledging their loyalty to some higher lord, instead of that, you simply had this large military, and that would dominate all of the smaller forces around it. And so this, of course, created the mega political conditions for the rise of the nation state. The nation state could most easily extract resources from its host population, from its host economy, in order to fund the largest military possible, in order to dominate in its region.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, one thing I found interesting too is this idea that how democratic a weapon is determines a lot about the meta-political conditions of the time. Like, they talk about how during the feudal age, like a knight on horseback could mow down like 100 peasants basically, and there's nothing they can do. And for a peasant, it's like they're never going to be able to afford armor. It's just like way, way, way outside and whatever their possible pay grade. And so you had this polarization of power. And then you end up in the industrial age, you end up in a situation where weapons become much more democratic. Like, you end up with the gun. The gun is like a great equalizer, because you have now a farmer is as well armed as a soldier. And so even though it's interesting, because it's almost like this point counterpoint, like even though you do get more offensive weapons with the industrial age, and you do get a transition towards centralized government, you also get a situation where the centralized government is the patron of all the people, because all the people have the power of the gun. And there's no super weapon that they don't have to negotiate with all these lords and all these different vassals that are all all have knights, all are knights, and all can wreak havoc if they want to. Like, everyone has the same moderately powerful weapon, and that is the gun. And so that's where you get this idea that all men are equal. They argue that idea could only emerge in the era of gunpowder.
Yeah, that's a great point. They talk about how, basically in order for somebody in the feudal age to become a knight, they had to pay the equivalent of $100,000 to buy a war horse and some armor. And so, if you could do that, then you could become this superhuman and become the law unto yourself. But obviously, as you noted, the advent of the gun basically equalizes everybody. It's interesting. I definitely agree with your argument, but also I see that the United States has, and large national militaries have much more powerful weapons than guns. They have, they have nuclear bombs, and they have, stealth fighters. But these things are not very effective against individuals. It's not like you can just go and, if you have some political dissident that you want to kill in some city, you could go nuke the city, but that would be counterproductive for you as a national government, because you'd be hurting your own legitimacy. So yeah.
There's something to it though. From a certain perspective, you can argue that the end of democracy was heralded by the invention of the tank, and then was secured by the invention of the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, tanks are almost like the parallel of a knight in armor during the feudal age. The difference is that a tank would be way more expensive than $100,000. It would be $1 million. I don't know, how much does a tank cost?
Millions of dollars. But it's interesting because the tank was what basically, it was a big part of what ended World War I, right? Trench warfare. You could almost say that the tank saved the nation state. If you had to if you had like maybe World War I might have continued forever and just would have devolved into like some kind of anarchic system if they hadn't invented like a super weapon that could take on the machine gun.
You know, it makes me wonder how much it would cost to build a tank in your own backyard. Like, we have the killdozer as a precedent, so maybe it's not all that difficult to build a tank.
Yeah, but obviously you don't want the authorities finding out that you're building a tank in your backyard. You could be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Well, that guy managed to hide it for long enough.
I mean, in the modern
That's
day,
good.
it wouldn't even be that useful probably, because now there's like, you know, like Chris said, like missile carriers and nuclear bombs. And
Well, yeah, and importantly, the killdozer was a suicide vehicle. Like, he literally made a crane that dropped the cover onto his Caterpillar, and he couldn't get out. So basically, he just killdozed until he had to commit suicide. So I mean, like a real tank that you would use as a real threat to the established order would need to be able to be like, you need to be able to get out of it and get back in.
Yes, or have it remote controlled.
So the Sovereign Individual does talk about the rise of like robot armies and how basically people who are good enough with computers might be able to have, like large physical standing armies that are made up of entirely of robots.
here's a question that this topic kind of brings up for me. This makes me think a lot of like the gun control debate, like this idea of all these ideas about the roles of weapons and the relationship between guns and democracy. And it makes me wonder, like, if we're looking at things through this lens, like, how do we interpret the gun control debate in the United States?
So if you talk to a lot of gun advocates, what they'll tell you is that it's codified in the law because that's the existing conditions on the ground. As you noted, you know, a well-armed populace keeps its government in check. And the reason for that is that if the government says guns are illegal, they still have to go take your gun. So, you know, and that involves them, that involves you shooting at them while they're trying to take your gun. And so the idea is that it's much more costly for them to do that than for them to just let you keep your gun and keep their legitimacy intact.
Yes. So I'd wonder about the opposite position, like from a person who advocates gun control. I guess, I mean, in their minds, obviously they're not like advocating the end of democracy or something like that, or advocating tyranny. There must be a more subtle position that's in mind for something like that. But there's something political underlying it.
It's interesting because, like, the book talks about how democracy is, in a lot of ways, it's this alliance between this massive centralized power and the common people, and to the detriment of like middle-sized powers. So it's interesting because it seems like both sides of the gun control debate are still sort of reinforcing that alliance. Like they're trying to keep that alliance strong in both cases. Like the pro Second Amendment gun people are like, we need to keep the populace strong, and that keeps the government strong, and we got to keep that populace government relationship healthy. And the anti-gun people are like, gun control people are like, basically more like, you know, we just got to have more trust in the government. Like the government is gonna do an okay job protecting us, and having guns around, we're risking putting power back in the hands of these like middle-sized powers that are going to terrorize us. So it seems like in both cases, they're reinforcing that the modern nation state system, but from a different angle.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with going back to the kind of parallels between government and religion. There's this very prevalent sense nowadays, and going back probably many decades, that if the government bans something, that it will lead to that thing going away. And so, you know, most people that you talk to really think this. They think, oh, well, you know, that thing is illegal, or the government should make that illegal, and that'll make it go away. And so I think gun control advocates are kind of having that in mind when they're advocating that the government take everybody's guns, because they're thinking, oh, well, you know, if nobody has guns, then there can't be gun violence. And so, of course, that's not the way that it really works, because, then only the law-abiding citizens will actually, yield their guns back to the government, whereas the people who don't care about following the law will keep their guns, and only the bad guys will have guns, basically.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because in general, when the government bans something, it does become less prevalent, even though it doesn't go away completely. So it's not like it's a completely vacuous argument.
Yeah, there's an incentive there. That when you disincentivize something, you are going to get less of it. But people always bring up Australia as a key case. But now, in the modern day, there are more guns in Australia, both illegal and legal, than ever. And the murder by firearm is still going down.
Hey, wait, what happened in Australia, Kurt? I don't know what the laws are there.
Okay. So this is a whole thing. But in 1997, there was an unfortunate event known as the Port Arthur Massacre. So someone took a firearm, a long arm, and murdered about 10 people, I believe, and wounded many more. And in response, the John Howard government said, okay, well, we're going to ban automatic weapons and I think also semi-automatic weapons. So, and tighten the controls on remaining weapons. So it's very difficult to get a gun in Australia, and there's all these things that you have to comply with. For example, if you keep it in your home, it needs to be a gun safe. It needs to have a lock. If you put it in your car, you need to have a safe in your car to transport it. It can't be taken out within city limit, probably, maybe even can't be taken out anywhere except licensed gun ranges. I don't know the details of the laws. They're quite cumbersome. So people point to Australia and say, well, that's a good example of where gun control worked. But it's not quite so clear when you look at the data. What happened was violent crime increased for a short time afterward, but then resumed its downward trend that it had for many years. The amount of shootings, they've been rare, and they've continued to be rare before and after. But I guess you could say that there are less, but there's always been very few. They're like anomalies. They're not something that happens every couple of months. It's something that happens every couple of years. So it's not clear exactly how gun control affected things in Australia.
Yeah, the way I see gun control is very similar to the way I see banning drugs. When the government makes something illegal, that doesn't automatically get rid of that thing. If there's a demand for a particular product and the government comes in and says, okay, we're going to punish people for selling this product, then what that does is it lowers the supply a bit, but the demand stays the same. And so what you get instead of the product disappearing is you get fewer of that product, but each instance of it is going to be more expensive. So
well, it doesn't exactly work that way, because the demand changes with criminalization. Like you see that like with prostitution, like when they make it legal, the demand skyrockets because it matters to a lot of people whether or not it's legal, both because there's penalties and because there's like the moral sanction.
Yeah, I guess there is kind of an interesting connection between morality and legality there, where, if something's against the law, then we assume that the general population thinks that thing is immoral. But I think maybe the effect that you described, where legalizing an action that was previously banned causes an explosion in the demand for that action. I think that's possibly a short-term effect. I think people are kind of like, woohoo, we're free, we can do whatever we want. And then after a while, the demand probably returns to somewhere around where it was previously. The people who want prostitution, are going to go get it, whether it's legal or not. And same thing with drugs and guns.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's much point having this conversation about speculating about statistics that we don't actually have at hand. maybe we can move on to the
Well,
next.
so actually, if you look at the numbers for people who are addicted to drugs before and after the war on drugs, you'll see that the addiction rates are exactly the same, regardless of how much money is spent on enforcement.
Okay.
So in that specific case, making it illegal had absolutely no effect.
Well, it was already illegal.
Except now the government is wasting a lot of money.
It was already illegal, but just the government was increasing its enforcement efforts, which is a kind of different, but probably related change in policy. Do we want to move on to our final section?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the final transition is the transition that we're allegedly currently in. That is the transition from the industrial age to what the authors call the information age, which I think a lot of people call it that. And basically, its driving force behind this transition is the changes in the mega-political landscape. Namely, that now we have this thing called the internet or cyberspace or the digital realm, where people can own property basically in this ether, in this kind of placeless ether. And in the digital realm, violence doesn't do anything for you. There's no way to violently take information, unless you can locate that person in the physical space, in meat space. And so as long as basically if you're on the internet and you're anonymously interacting with other people on the internet, there's pretty much nothing that even a large military like the United States can do to stop you from conducting your business, as long as it's purely digital and you're staying relatively anonymous. And so this is going to cause some huge changes. Most importantly, it's going to decrease the power of the nation state. And the reason it's going to do this is because the nation state currently sustains itself through its military, which it sustains through funding, which it gets from inflation and taxation. And so basically the big technological change that's going to cause this transition is digital money, things like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. And so this protects people from inflation and taxation. It protects them from taxation because they're anonymous and there's no way for the government to track them down and figure out how much they're earning. And it protects them from inflation because, of course, as we know, Bitcoin supply is fixed and there's no way to arbitrarily print more. So yeah, basically the authors predict that the power of the nation state will decline because their ability to fund their militaries will decline. And so militaries will fragment and become smaller, and jurisdictions will fragment and become smaller. And we should actually have a lot less violence all over the world as we see wealth moving from the physical realm into the digital realm. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think this shift is happening?
So yes, I believe that this shift is happening. So you mentioned about how Vice, one example of that is with Silk Road and darknet markets, how they've actually given an opportunity for people dealing illicit substances to sell in a market where violence becomes very difficult. So that's one example of how violence will be reduced in the information age.
Yeah, I definitely agree that darknet markets are helping to make the drug trade a lot less violent. And they're, basically, as they say, the war on drugs is over. Drugs won.
It seems like this change is happening to a certain extent. Like it is true that a lot of commerce is going online. It's going to be harder to control. And it's unclear. What's unclear to me is whether governments are going to figure out a way to tax and control the commerce anyway, like if they're going to win the cyber war in some way, which doesn't seem completely impossible to me. Whether the transition is going to be partial, so the governments have to tax less, but they're still able to tax and they're still able to have a partial welfare state, or whether it's going to be complete, like the authors of the book are suggesting, where the welfare state is completely destroyed and commerce becomes very decentralized.
Yeah, they do say that governments will still be able to enforce consumption taxes, and property taxes. So if you're if you're running a store and you're selling goods in your store, then the government is going to see those activities, no matter how much you try to hide it. I mean, you can, try to do all your dealing in shady alleyways, but that's going to be a high cost. And hopefully governments will see the writing on the wall and they'll lower the tax rates to make it favorable for people to follow the tax laws.
Another thing that I think lends a lot of evidence to the idea that governments won't be able to control the flow of money is that when funds are stolen in Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, people appeal to the FBI or other law enforcement agencies, and these agencies respond by saying, there's nothing we can do. So basically, it's like they're admitting that they have no control over the funds. So previously, when security was this function of government, protection was this function of government, like during the Dark Ages, now they don't have that function so much anymore because they can't protect our cryptocurrencies.
Right, and this situation is reminiscent of when gold was the reserve currency. If you got your gold stolen from you, there wasn't much the government can do either. So I think we're returning to something akin to that. So what parallels can we draw between the fall of the Roman Empire and this, and the feudal transition, and the transition into the industrial age and the nation state? I feel like there are parallels between basically all of those transitions and what's happening now.
I guess, okay, here's something you mentioned at the beginning, Chris, but we could flesh out a little bit more is at the end of the Roman period, something you talked about that was really interesting is no one really realized that the Roman Empire had fallen. Now we look back at when the barbarians took over and Ododacer displaced the emperor. We look back at that and we say that's when the empire fell. But at the time, people didn't think that way because the emperor, he was retired with a pension. So that made it seem like the system was still working. Ododacer, he didn't declare himself the emperor. He said the emperor in the east is the emperor and I'm his protector of the empire in the west. And they just the Roman Empire continued in name, but not really in function. And so one thing that's interesting is that the authors of the book suggest is that the system of nation states might go the same way. Like we might have something that continues to be called the United States long after all the functions that we now associate with the United States are long gone.
Yeah, I've definitely had the same thought that the authors of this book appear to be predicting that all of the jurisdictions are going to just shrink down, and that's where all the real political power will be. And I think that's true to some extent, but I also think that these large supranational organizations, things like the United Nations and the European Union and NATO and trade organizations, that these will continue functioning, and that they will provide a kind of consensus building mechanism whereby individual city-states and small jurisdictions can kind of come to an agreement as to kind of have a common vision, at least regionally, maybe even globally. There will be points, like common points, where very disparate peoples around the globe can kind of coordinate and make decisions on a global basis or on a regional basis.
And well, there's a difference between something continuing to function and something continuing to exist in name without functioning.
Right. Like I think that the United States could end up being more of a sort of Articles of Confederation, like it was before we had the United States Constitution, where it was this loose loose federation of states, which were all sovereign. And the Articles of Confederation were simply this consensus mechanism whereby they all agreed to certain things, but it didn't have any enforcement power. It was just like a consensus mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, like the power of the Roman Empire has never truly been eradicated, right? Like even today, the idea of the Roman Empire and the name of the Roman Empire and the symbols associated with it still have a power. And I could see that. I think the United States and all the symbols associated with it, and the word the United States and the word America, like they're still going to have a lot of power for a very long time, regardless of what happens.
I wanted to touch on also another important theme of the book, which has to do with the end of the industrial age and why it's ending. And this is why liberal democracies have come to be dominant in the information age. It's this kind of paradox where, because the government allows its citizens more economic freedom, and it gives them this vote, which makes them feel like they have a voice in government, even though maybe it doesn't really. So it creates this sense of legitimacy, this sense of rule of law, this sense of things are relatively prosperous. And so what that does is it actually creates a larger economy. And then the government, even though it's taking a lower proportion of the spoils, it actually produces a larger military overall. And in the age of violence, as they call it, or the industrial age, this is how you predominated. You just created the largest military force in the world. And so basically the United States won that game. But an interesting thing that they argue is that the Soviet Union was like the fraternal twin of liberal democracies. Communism was a fraternal twin of liberal democracies. And seeing it die is not, necessarily a good omen for liberal democracies.
Wait, before you move on, do you want to just elaborate that argument, what you mean by the Soviet Union and the United States being fraternal twins?
Yeah, so basically they're both of the same kind, according to the book. That being, there are these large nation states that project power at a distance very effectively because they can most effectively extract resources from the largest economies. And so in the area of the nation state, it was important to have a large economy and to be able to extract a high percentage of the resources that economy produced. And so basically the United States won that game. And so now the game is changing.
Well, I don't know a lot about the specifics of how the USSR fell, but maybe one of you knows a bit more about that and could compare it to what it might look like if the United States fell.
I know a little bit about it. So a big factor in the fall of the Soviet Union was actually peak oil. Because what happened is the Soviet Union actually almost fell decades before, but they happened to find oil, I believe in Siberia. I'm not entirely sure, but they found oil within their own territories in like 1959. So they were able to continue their industrial operations for many decades because they basically had these really expensive industrial operations and they did not have the efficiency to pay for them. And so they just basically found free oil and used that for many decades. And then in the 80s, they were running out of oil again. And that's part of the reason why they went to Afghanistan and had a disastrous imperial war there that drained a lot of their resources further and didn't get them back the resources they were hoping for. And so that was economically a big part of the reason why the Soviet Union fell, because they were so inefficient. Like none of their operations were not producing wealth for them. They were subsisting off of this free wealth, basically. And so that was one factor. And culturally, there was another big factor as well, because Gorbachev became the, forget what the name was of the leader of the Soviet Union.
The premier.
I don't think it was
premier.
premier.
Anyway. Premier of the Communist Party. I thought that was his name.
Okay, premier. Anyway, Gorbachev became the premier. He became the leader, and he had this whole idea of like perestroika and glasnost, which was like economic and cultural freedom. And so something that he did, he brought in a lot more like freedom of speech. He brought in more culture and art and culture from the West, which actually, from one perspective, was a big mistake because it destroyed a lot of the illusions that were kind of holding the Soviet Union together. Like a lot of like the Soviet citizens, like they believed that basically like people were starving on the streets in America. And so the bread line sucks, but at least we're not in America with the capitalists starving on the streets. But when Gorbachev allowed like American TV shows in, like in this book I read, there was talking about how like the Soviet citizens, they would be like watching the TV, not for the story, but like counting the number of rooms in the house and counting the number of items of food in the fridge. And it introduced them to Western wealth in a way that was very visceral and was hard to say. It was hard for the Soviet Union to say that's just propaganda, that's a lie, because they were seeing it, even though it was through the medium of television. And at the same time, Gorbachev started doing this thing where he was like encouraging criticism of the government. And so once people kind of started criticizing the government, they realized they sort of had like a million criticisms of the government. And they actually hated the government. And it was just all these things he did. There's a whole bunch of other things too. Like he gave the different Soviet states more independence and just all this. Like basically he was trying to loosen it up so that it survived. Really, he loosened it up and it just, the whole thing crumbled, it crashed to the ground. And so there's a lot more factors, but those are some factors that led up to it. And I mean, now that we have a little bit of that background, how do you guys see that could parallel the United States?
Oh, that's cool. I mean, it's a bit hard to compare that because, I mean, people do have freedom of speech in the United States, but it's like, I suppose their freedom of speech is limited a bit by their education. Like people don't think too much outside of what they're told on television and what they're taught in schools. So I can't imagine a US president getting up and encouraging people to criticize the government. If that happened, I'd say the United States government would probably go the same way, and maybe it would separate into the 50 states.
I don't know. I kind of disagree, because I feel like part of the thing that happened in the Soviet Union was that people were just, it was like verboten to like criticize the government for decades and decades. Like it was just like everyone had to be like, government is good, government is good, government is good. And you know, like no one believed it, but everyone had to say it. And finally, when they were allowed to criticize or encouraged to, they just like, it was like the floodgates opened. And the US doesn't have that same built up pressure because there is a strong culture of free speech, especially compared to like the former USSR.
Yeah, that's true. Do you have some thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, no, I was looking at what the leader of the Soviet Union was called. He's called the premier, but it actually had three names: the chairman, the prime minister, and the president. So a bunch of different names. But yeah, I mean, the way that I see the United States going, and I think the sovereign individual makes this argument later, is similar to how the Soviet Union fell, where people get more freedom, and then they realize that they have more freedom, and so they start doing more, and they start basically disobeying a lot more. And the government, at the same time, is losing its ability to enforce this kind of common legal structure throughout all of the 50 states. And then what you should start seeing is secession movements. And I think that you are seeing this in Western civilization increasingly. You're seeing people saying, you know, why are we part of this, you know, gigantic, massive land with all these people that, you know, we never see and we don't have much in common with? You know, let's break off and make our own thing. So I think you're going to see more of that, and the government might, obviously in the Civil War, the Union Army defeated the Confederate Army, and the federal government basically won that conflict. But mega political conditions are different now, and I think it's very likely that maybe there will be a few secession attempts that fail, but then they'll start succeeding, and then everything will just fall apart, just how it did in the Soviet Union. Maybe it won't happen exactly that way, but that's kind of one way I see it unfolding.
Just something quick. So people also talk about, well, maybe it's very difficult for states in the US to secede, but there is this kind of de facto secession that's happening with things like cannabis prohibition. The individual states disregard the federal states' orders on that, and that could happen in other areas as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is like in the Soviet Union, prior to Gorbachev, there was like this communist. So like the USSR was like Russia and like I forget how many 14 other states that were part of the Soviet Union, and so the Communist Party had its main headquarters in Russia, but it had operatives throughout the entire Soviet Union. And so if you had like a government of a country like Kazakhstan, it was almost like they would call it like there was the government and the shadow government. So there was like the Kazakhstani government, like they had like the premier, like its own structure. And then there was the Communist Party, and every single kind of politician would have like a Communist Party counterpart. So there was like the government and the shadow government. And that obviously doesn't exist in the United States. But one thing I could see, if you want to draw a parallel, I could see a parallel between like if federal agents, federal enforcement, federal presence in individual states was withdrawn, and the kind of federal level of the United States sort of withdrawing to Washington and being less present in the other states. I guess that being a strong parallel between not only the dissolution of the USSR, but also the dissolution of, because Gorbachev pulled away the shadow government, basically. He pulled away the Communist Party back to Russia, which was a big part of what precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I can see a parallel there between the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the collapse of the Roman Empire, because that's a big part of the Roman Empire's collapse. Is like at the height of the empire, you had like Roman agents out like in Scotland, right? Like all the way, like they had a massive reach of like thousands and thousands of miles. But then as the empire, it was a more gradual, like with Gorbachev, he just pulled them all away. But with the Roman Empire, it was like slowly receding. Like the agents you'd have a spot where a few years ago there would be a Roman outpost. Now there wasn't anymore. And everything just became slowly closer and closer to Rome. And then in the end, there was nothing.
Right, exactly. Because as you know, the ability for the nation state to project its power happens through its military, and that happens through funding. And as their funding as their sources of funding kind of dwindle away, the distance at which they can project power will decrease. So I definitely see that. I definitely agree with what you're saying. I wanted to note that I've always heard it Gorbachev, not Gorbakov. Maybe those are two accepted pronunciations or something like that. But
I might be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Gorbachev.
Okay.
So one of the reasons why I really thought this was an important book is that I read it while I basically identified as an ANCAP. And then after reading this book, it makes several very good arguments against basically anarcho-capitalism. And so we can talk about that now, or we can talk about that later. But I thought that was an interesting topic that we should discuss at some point.
So let's talk about it now for a bit. What are the arguments that you think the book makes against anarcho-capitalism?
So basically, the idea of anarcho-capitalism, the important difference between how things happen in Ancapistan, as they call it, and the way things currently are, difference is that there are these private security agencies rather than governments. And law will be decentralized. You'll be able to follow,
So this is like an ANCAP utopian idea.
Yes, exactly. In Ancapistan, it's like this, ANCAP country or something like that.
Okay. So you have private security. Continue.
Yeah. And so basically you have these multiple rights protection organizations. And there are actually a lot of different proposals for how this would work. I think the most compelling arguments come from David Friedman. And so he talks about these rights enforcement agencies, and basically you sign up for protection as in the sovereign individual, they say governments are for protection. That's, what they're for. You pay them, taxpayers pay the government in order to provide this protection. And so according to ANCAPs, these would be private organizations just providing protection. And if somebody abridges your rights, if somebody robs you or murders somebody that you know, then you would be able to go to this organization and they would somehow get justice for you. They would probably what would happen, according to David Friedman, is that the rights organizations would work with each other in order to minimize violence, because violence is bad for business. But the important distinction between that and what we have now, other than the fact that government is supposed to be this public organization that's owned by everyone instead of private organizations, the important distinction between that and what we have now is that there would be multiple competing security organizations in the same jurisdiction. And I basically, after reading this book, I decided that was untenable, because the book makes good arguments as to why you don't want competing violent organizations in the same area, because what happens is those organizations compete violently, which creates a lot of violence, which creates a lot of instability, which is bad for business. And so ANCAPs have this idea, everybody will just be voluntarist, everybody will be peaceful, and they won't want violence. And it's like, well, except for the people who want violence. Maybe 99% of the people don't want violence and are not willing to employ it, but that 1% of people who do are going to end up in charge of the security organizations, and they're going to end up controlling everything, and we're just going to end up right back where we are. So that was kind of the argument that kind of tipped me past anarchism, where I was like, okay, well, you do need some kind of, in any given jurisdiction, it's much better to have a clear monopoly on violence, because that produces stability. It creates trust. Businesses can start building and growing and making money, because they don't, if things go into anarchy and there's all this violence and turmoil, then businesses will simply move elsewhere. And then there's no wealth for the governments to extract. Or there's no customers for the rights protection organizations.
Interesting. So this kind of was where you got this idea that you sometimes talk about, that like governments are a kind of business. Yes.
Yeah, I think this was originally where I read that. Although that idea is kind of very widespread now, especially in more right-wing corners of the internet. But actually, yeah, I mean, so anarchists, especially ANCAPs, would argue this. Like, what is government? It's just this big corporation, and it's not a particularly nice corporation. It provides protection, but then it also robs you of everything that you can possibly afford.
So after reading this book and going through this transformation, Chris, like, do you still have I'm interested more how it changed your mindset? Like, were you a voluntarist before?
I don't know if I was ever a voluntarist. I think I heard the term voluntarist like right after I read this book. And at that point I was already already on my way out. I was like, okay, well, yeah, voluntarism is nice. Pacifism is nice, but it's not practical. And I had, it was almost like the reason why I ended up leaving like Catholicism and Christianity is because like there are these contradictions that are built into the philosophy. And so in anarcho-capitalism, the contradiction was, let's study economics and let's study supply and demand and let's learn about Austrian economics and let's, learn about how people are very predictable when the incentives are a certain way. You can basically, if you look at what the incentives are in a particular environment, you can predict what people's behavior will be like on a whole within that environment. And so ANCAPism is very is very pro economics. It's like, let's look at the incentives. Let's see what people are going to do. But they have this blind spot for the incentives behind violence. They basically, the philosophy is basically, well, there are no incentives for violence. And so why would people be violent? And so if you look at just how things are in the world, and the sovereign individual makes this argument, well, there's still a lot of violence. And so clearly there are still incentives for violence. And so in order to get rid of the violence, you have to get rid of the incentives. And so, I used to be kind of like normatively an ANCAP. I was like, oh, the government's evil. We need to make it smaller. And then what I realized was, well, it's already kind of doing that. It's already kind of on its way out, and it's on its way to becoming fairer and providing a better service at a lower cost. So, instead of railing against the government and yelling and saying, we need to change things and, having these normative positions, I realized that it was more helpful to just realize how reality is and where it's going and prepare for it and help other people prepare for it. So yeah, this book was very pivotal in my life.
That's really interesting. I'm tempted to ask about how one would prepare for it and stuff like that, but I feel like we're going to get into that next week during our sequel to this, where we talk more about the information age and what that's going to look like.
Well, first I wanted to ask Kurt. Kurt, do you have any final thoughts on all this? I know last I heard you were maybe an anarcho-capitalist still. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't really identify as an anarcho-capitalist. Maybe more of a voluntarist, because that's more easygoing. I think that opens up more questions about how a society might be structured. I do like the idea of anarchy without adjectives, but that also does seem a little reckless, because maybe it's like, well, what happens when we get rid of government? And we don't really know. So it might be a very fatal experiment. But basically, my perspective is I don't really think about it that much. Like I don't have to worry about what state the world is in, because it's, in a sense, it's not my business. Like, what is my business? Tending to my garden, taking care of the things that are in front of me. And I don't have to worry whether everybody in the world is free or something like that, but I can express my freedom. And I try to do that in the extreme way, like try to live free and I try to love free. And I think it's kind of working.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely think that despite all of its faults, capitalism and the nation state have led us to a period in history where the individual does have more freedom than ever before. I think it will continue to increase. Of course, the reason why the book is called The Sovereign Individual, which we didn't even talk about, is that it predicts that individuals will become sovereign, that they will become essentially so free that they are not beholden to any particular government. And so I think that's true. I think that's where we're headed, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Tune in next week for a discussion on that topic.
Thank you, friends, for coming with us on this journey into politics and economics and history. I hope you found it educational and entertaining, as always, and we hope you tune in next week for the next part of this exciting topic. Thanks, guys.
If you like what we do, then like, subscribe, follow us on Patreon, leave us a comment, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.